Have you ever trained someone? Sat with them, walked them through the job you'd spent years building expertise in? The frameworks, the shortcuts, the unwritten rules that nobody documents because everyone assumes you'll just figure them out eventually, and then watch that person get everything you were working toward? The title, the raise, the office with the window. Maybe they were younger. Maybe they were visibly less prepared. Maybe you sat in meetings and watched them present concepts you had explained to them the night before, and the room responded like they were watching something brilliant, and you kept your face neutral because that's what professionals do and because losing your composure in a conference room never helps anyone, least of all you. And maybe when you tried to make sense of how this was happening, the answer wasn't subtle at all. It wasn't a skills gap you'd missed or a blind spot in your own performance. It wasn't anything you had done or failed to do. It was a last name, or a handshake at the right charity event, or a golf game, or a nephew. We have a word for it, nepotism, but the word doesn't quite capture what it actually costs. What it actually costs is this: you played by the rules. You did the work. You showed up, stayed late, produced results that moved the company forward, and you believed, maybe naively, maybe stubbornly, that merit was the currency that mattered. And then someone walked in through a side door that was never listed in the employee handbook and collected everything you'd been working toward, and nobody seemed to think it required an explanation. My name is Cole Davenport, and I'm going to tell you about 14 months I spent at Alderton Creative Group in Austin, Texas, and about a man named Bryce Calloway, and about a single email chain that ended his golden boy status so cleanly and so completely that I still think about it sometimes when I need to remember that the truth, properly documented and professionally delivered, is the most powerful tool in any workplace. Stay with me. This one ends exactly the way you want it to. Let me tell you about Alderton Creative Group, because context matters and I want you to understand what I was walking into. Mid-size brand strategy agency. About 90 people. Based in Austin, which at the time had that particular energy of a city that knew it was becoming something. Tech money filtering in, the creative scene still intact, a professional landscape where ambition felt possible in a way that larger, more saturated cities had started to lose. Alderton had been around for 15 years, founded by a man named Robert Alderton who had built something genuinely good from nothing. The work was strong. The client list was respectable. The culture had that collaborative, slightly informal quality that smaller agencies develop when the people inside them actually like each other. I joined as a senior brand strategist 4 years before this story takes place. I had come from a larger agency in Dallas where I developed a real foundation, audience research, positioning architecture, brand narrative development, and I had joined Alderton because the work felt more meaningful at that scale. You could see the impact more clearly. You could own a project from start to finish rather than managing one narrow slice of a larger machine. 4 years in, I was leading a 5-person brand team. Unofficial lead. That phrase is doing significant work, and I want to sit with it for a moment, because I think a lot of people watching this know exactly what it means. Unofficial lead means you carry the weight of the role without the title, the compensation, or the organizational recognition that should accompany it. It means you are, in practice, the person everyone comes to when something needs to get done right. It means your manager pulls you aside before important meetings to align on approach. It means you write the frameworks that other people present. It means the client calls you first when something comes up, even if someone else is theoretically the point of contact. It also means that when promotion conversations happen, you get told that a director title is being considered for the next review cycle. Those 2 words, being considered, I've thought about them a lot since. They're the corporate equivalent of telling someone their table is almost ready when you have no idea when their table will be ready. It keeps you standing by the door. It keeps you from leaving. I was at Alderton 4 years, leading the team unofficially, waiting for my table, when Bryce Calloway arrived. He was introduced at an all-company meeting on a Wednesday morning, one of those standing room gatherings in the main open floor where Glenn Alderton, our CEO and the founder's son, would share updates and occasionally introduce new hires. Glenn was a capable operator who had grown up inside his father's company and knew it well. He was not the visionary his father had been, but he kept things running and occasionally made smart decisions. He also had one significant blind spot: family. He introduced Bryce with a particular warmth that people reserve for someone they have a personal stake in. Bryce was his cousin. He said Bryce had incredible instincts, a phrase that in my experience is deployed most frequently about people whose instincts have not yet been tested by anything consequential. He said Bryce was joining as a senior brand strategist, fresh from completing his MBA at a school with a name that Glenn mentioned once and didn't need to mention twice. Same title as mine. 0 years of professional experience in the field. I sat in the 4th row with a coffee in my hand and kept my expression professionally open, which is the face you make when you are processing something that you need time to process, and this is not the time. After the meeting, my direct manager, a woman named Lena who was sharp, well-intentioned, and clearly aware that she'd been handed an awkward situation, pulled me aside in the hallway and said, "I just want you to make sure you know, this doesn't change the director conversation. We're still very much on track with that." She said it the way people say things they're not entirely sure are true but genuinely hope will be. The fact that she said it unprompted, before I'd asked, before I'd indicated any reaction at all, told me more than the words themselves. Bryce was assigned to my project, not to a general onboarding track, not to a smaller account where he could develop his skills with appropriate supervision and stakes. To my team, to the grocery chain rebrand, a regional chain called Harker's that was in the middle of the most significant expansion in their 40-year history and needed their brand identity to grow with them. It was the most complex, highest-profile project I had managed in 4 years. I had a client who trusted me completely, a timeline that was ambitious but achievable, and a clear understanding that this project, delivered well, would be the definitive argument for my promotion. It was, in other words, exactly the wrong project to share. Now, and I want to say this carefully because I think it matters, Bryce was not stupid. I've told this story enough times to know that people expect the nepotism hire to be a complete disaster, incompetent in every direction. Bryce wasn't that. He was smart in certain ways. He was genuinely likable. He had the social fluency that comes from spending your whole life in environments where you were welcomed unconditionally, an ease in rooms, a comfort with eye contact, a way of making people feel like they were being heard that translated extremely well in client settings. What he could not do was build. He couldn't construct a strategy from the ground up. When I reviewed his early drafts, which Lena had designated as part of a formal mentorship structure, which meant I was officially responsible for his development, which was its own particular flavor of irony, what I found were documents that had the shape of strategy without the substance. The vocabulary was right. The headings were correct. But when you looked for the thinking underneath, the actual insight that justified the direction, the research that supported the claim, it wasn't there. It was like a building with a beautiful facade and no load-bearing walls. I rewrote his sections. I asked him questions, careful, Socratic questions, that helped him find better answers, and then I integrated those answers into the work. I explained my reasoning on every structural decision because I genuinely believed he was learning and because that's what good mentorship looks like. He absorbed quickly. He was good at translating what I'd built into language that landed well in a room. He was an excellent presenter, animated, confident, responsive, the kind of presenter who makes clients feel safe. And that was exactly the problem. 10 weeks in, Glenn sat in on a Harker's presentation. Bryce led it. He was outstanding, polished in a way that comes naturally to people who have always been told they're outstanding, responsive to Glenn's questions in real time, drawing connections between the strategy and the client's business goals in a way that felt instinctive and sharp. The Harker's team was visibly energized. Glenn was visibly proud. Afterward, in the parking garage, I watched Glenn put his hand on Bryce's shoulder and say, loud, comfortable, not performing it because it didn't occur to him that it needed performing. That is the Alderton standard right there. That's what we do. I had written the presentation, the positioning framework that had driven the whole strategic direction, the 3-tier audience segmentation that had restructured how Harker's thought about their customer base, the brand narrative architecture that Glenn had called exactly right during the Q&A. All of it had originated at my desk, on my laptop, in the hours I spent thinking through problems before Bryce arrived in the morning. What Bryce had done was take what I'd built, understand it well enough to speak to it, and deliver it with a confidence and fluency that I had in my own quieter, more analytical register, also produced, but in a form that didn't land the same way in a room full of executives who responded to performance. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I was not catastrophizing. I was doing math. If the Harkers project was the argument for my promotion, and I'd been told that explicitly, and Bryce was now the visible face of the Harkers project in the room where Glenn Alderton made decisions, then the math was not working in my favor. The work was mine. The credit was migrating. And the institutional logic of how these things unfold meant that by the time the Harkers project concluded, the story of who had done it would be set, and it would not be accurate. I needed to decide what I was going to do about that. Over the next 4 months, I watched the pattern repeat and deepen. Every major deliverable on the project had the same architecture. I built the foundation, Bryce presented the house. His name was on the client-facing materials. Mine was on the drafts that preceded them. When Glenn dropped into team reviews, which happened with increasing frequency as the project gained visibility, it was Bryce who walked him through the work, who fielded the questions, who inhabited the room in the way Glenn recognized and responded to. I was present. I was professional. I contributed in ways that anyone paying attention could see. Glenn was not paying that kind of attention. The Harkers rebrand launched in month 7. By every measure, it was a success. The client was thrilled. Regional press covered it. One industry publication ran a short feature on the identity work. Glenn sent a company-wide email the morning it launched that called it a defining moment for what Alderton can do. I read that email at my desk and felt something complicated, pride in the work, which was genuine, alongside something harder to name. The specific feeling of watching something you built be celebrated in a room that doesn't fully know you built it. 2 weeks later, Bryce was promoted to Director of Brand Strategy. I found out from an org chart update that came through on a Tuesday morning. A routine HR distribution that went to the full company. I was scanning it when I saw it. Bryce Calloway, Director, Brand Strategy. I scrolled to my own name. Cole Davenport, Senior Brand Strategist. Nothing had changed for me. Everything had changed for him. The title I had been told was being considered had been given, without any conversation, to someone who had been at the company for 7 months. I closed the email. I opened the HR portal, an internal system I had legitimate access to, granted the previous year when I'd helped audit a vendor cost document, access that had simply never been revoked. I want to be clear about this. I accessed nothing I wasn't authorized to access. I simply looked at something that was available to me and had been sitting there, accessible, for 12 months. I pulled up compensation records. Bryce's base salary was $31,000 more than mine. He had been at the company 7 months. I had been there 4 years. For a significant portion of those 7 months, I had been developing his skills, building the work he was presenting, and effectively subsidizing his credibility with my own expertise. $31,000. I sat with that number for a long time. Not in shock. Somewhere beneath the shock, I think I had already known something like this was true, had been choosing not to look at it directly because looking at it directly required me to do something about it, and doing something about it required a level of deliberate confrontation that I had been, until this moment, successfully postponing. I couldn't postpone it anymore. I opened a blank document. I typed 4 words. This ends on my terms. And I started planning. I want to be direct about something before I walk you through what I did next, because I think it matters. I was not trying to destroy Bryce. I was not trying to blow up the company, settle a personal score, or manufacture some cathartic confrontation that would make me feel powerful for a day and create professional fallout I'd be managing for years. That is the impulsive version of this story, and the impulsive version gets you nowhere good. What I wanted was specific and legitimate. I wanted the truth on the record, I wanted the gap between contribution and compensation corrected, and I wanted the people making decisions about my career to have accurate information when they made them. That's it. Clean, professional, entirely defensible. I gave myself 3 rules going in. Rule 1. Everything I did had to be factually accurate and professionally framed. No exaggeration, no emotional language, no accusation I couldn't support with documentation. The moment you overreach, you give the other side something to argue about, and I was not going to give anyone anything to argue about. Rule 2. I would not tip my hand to anyone inside the company until I was ready to move. Not to Lena, not to colleagues I trusted, not to anyone. Discretion was not just practical, it was strategic. The element of timing mattered enormously. Rule 3. I would not rush. I had waited 4 years already. I could wait another 4 weeks to do this correctly. The first thing I did was build the documentation. Over the previous 7 months, every significant piece of work I had produced for Bryce had passed through company email. I had sent him drafts, frameworks, strategic rationales, research summaries, revised sections, all of it time-stamped, all of it in my sent folder, all of it creating an unambiguous paper trail of authorship. I went back through every exchange, organized it chronologically, and mapped it against the final client-facing deliverables. I did this at home, on my personal laptop, pulling only from my own email sent folder, my emails, my documents, my work product. Nothing that required unauthorized access, nothing that involved anyone else's private information. What I found, laid out in sequence, was striking. On the Harkers project alone, the project that had been the visible centerpiece of Bryce's 7-month tenure and the stated basis for his promotion, the strategic content was traceable to my work at a rate that was, to put it plainly, difficult to characterize as collaborative. The positioning framework, the audience segmentation model, the competitive differentiation analysis, the brand voice architecture. For each one, I had a corresponding email in my sent folder, dated days or weeks before it appeared in a client deck under Bryce's name. In several cases, the language in his final document was nearly identical to language in my draft. 41 pages of documentation, organized cleanly, with a summary index at the front. I spent 9 days building it. I treated it with the same rigor I'd applied to every strategy document I'd ever produced for a client, because it was, in its own way, a strategy document. The subject was different. The stakes were more personal. The standard of evidence had to be higher. The second thing I did was formally request a compensation and title review. I went to Lena. I told her, calmly and directly, that I was requesting a formal review of my compensation and title relative to my contributions and to market rates. I said I had led the Harkers project, that I had been in my role for 4 years, and that I expected a director-level conversation. Not hoped. Expected. Lena was visibly uncomfortable. She said she'd raise it. She mentioned budget pressures. I acknowledged that I understood budget pressures exist and said I'd like the review to proceed regardless. 3 weeks later, I sat across from Lena and Raymond, our HR director, a careful and methodical man who I'd always read as someone who took the rules seriously, and they told me that a director title was not available at this time. Budget was constrained. My contributions were enormously valued. I said, "Can you help me understand why a director title was available 7 months ago for someone who had been here 7 months, when it isn't available now for someone who has been here 4 years and led the project that just generated your most significant press coverage of the year?" The silence that followed was the silence of 2 people who did not have a clean answer and knew it. Raymond said, "Give us a few days to look further into this." I said, "Of course." And I meant it. Because I knew that looking into it was not going to produce the outcome I needed, not without something more concrete to look at. Organizational inertia is powerful. Discomfort fades. Conversations get softened over time. I needed to create a condition where the truth was unavoidable rather than inconvenient. Which brought me to the email. 1 email. 3 paragraphs. No emotional language. No accusation. Just facts and attached documentation, addressed to Raymond in HR and to Glenn Alderton directly, CC'd to Lena. Subject line: Documentation of contributions, Brand Strategy Team, months 1 to 14. The body of the email was careful and professional. I wrote it 5 times before I was satisfied with it. The framing was, in advance of our ongoing compensation review, I want to ensure that the full scope of my contributions to the brand strategy team is visible to the relevant decision-makers, as I believe some of this context may not be fully apparent from the official deliverables alone. I've attached supporting documentation for reference. 41 pages attached. I sent it on a Thursday morning at 9:04 a.m., from my desk, with both hands steady and a cup of coffee that I did not spill. By 11:30 a.m., a calendar invite had appeared in my inbox from Glenn Alderton's executive assistant. Subject: Cole plus Glenn, Monday, 9 a.m. No additional context. Just the meeting, the time, and Glenn's name. I accepted it. I told no one. I went back to my work, answered my emails, attended the afternoon team check-in where Bryce walked the team through a strategic update on a new project, using, I noted, a competitive landscape framework that had originated in a document I'd shared with him 4 days earlier. I smiled. I contributed appropriately. I was the most professional person in that room. I was excellent at waiting. Monday morning. I got to the office at 8. Not because I needed to be there at 8. I needed to be there because arriving early when something significant is happening is a form of control. You choose the pace. You set the terms of your own composure. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and reviewed my documentation one final time, not because there was anything left to review, but because rereading work you know is solid before walking into a difficult room is one of the better professional habits I've developed. Glenn's office was on the top floor. Corner space, exposed brick, a long low table instead of a traditional desk, the kind of intentionally informal setup that signals creative leadership and costs more than a traditional office would. Plants on the windowsill, morning light coming through eastern-facing glass, Austin spread out below it in that particular flat grid way that makes the city look deceptively simple from above. Glenn was already there when I arrived. So was Raymond, with a printed copy of my documentation in front of him, tabbed, I noticed. Color-coded tabs, evenly placed, the work of someone who had spent real time with the material. And in one of the chairs along the wall, slightly apart, was Bryce. He had not been told I was coming. I knew that immediately, not from his expression, which he controlled well, but from the quarter-second delay before he composed it. The body processing unexpected information before the face catches up. He looked at me, he looked at the table, he looked back at me, and then he smiled with the practiced ease of a man who had been trained by his entire life to appear comfortable in rooms. I nodded at him. I sat down. Glenn said, Cole, thanks for coming up. I've spent some time with what you sent us, and I want to have an honest conversation. He paused. He looked at Bryce. He said, directly and without softening it, Bryce, I asked Cole to join us because I want to address some things that came to my attention this week. Cole submitted documentation, detailed documentation, of the strategic work produced by the brand team over the past 14 months, including attribution of specific deliverables. Raymond and I have reviewed it with legal. We have significant concerns about attribution and compensation that are going to require a formal internal process. Bryce opened his mouth. He said, I mean everything we did was collaborative. Cole and I worked closely together. Glenn looked at Raymond. Raymond turned to a specific page, one I had flagged in my documentation, one I had known would carry the most weight when it was read in a room. It was an email I had sent to Bryce at 10:52 p.m. on a Sunday night. A complete positioning framework, fully developed, 47 lines of strategic thinking that formed the spine of the Harker's brand direction. Bryce's reply the following morning at 8:33 a.m. This is exactly what we needed. I'm going to drop this into the deck and clean up the formatting before the 2 o'clock. Raymond read the exchange aloud. Then he said, Bryce, this email shows Cole sending you a complete, fully developed positioning framework the night before a major client presentation. The framework in the final deck is substantively identical to what he sent. Can you characterize the nature of your contribution to that framework? The room held the question. Bryce said, he was helping me develop the thinking. Raymond said, there are 37 similar exchanges in this documentation, across 9 major deliverables, over a 14-month period. Silence. Not dramatic silence, not the kind you see in movies where someone slams a folder and someone else storms out. The quieter, more durable silence of a fact landing in a room and being unable to be unlanded. Glenn looked at Bryce with an expression I recognized but had never seen on him before, the expression of a man who has just been shown the gap between what he assumed and what was true, and who is making peace with the gap in real time. Bryce stared at the table. His jaw was set. His hands, which had been relaxed on the armrests when I walked in, were now folded in his lap. A small, specific shift in body language that meant something. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important to be honest about it. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumph would have been cheap, and I had not done any of this for cheap feelings. What I felt was something closer to relief. The specific relief that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being able to set it down in a room where the right people could see what it weighed. Glenn looked at me. He said, "Cole, I owe you an apology. Not just on my own behalf, on behalf of this company. What you've documented represents a failure of oversight that I am responsible for, and that failure cost you real professional and financial opportunity. I want to be direct about that, and I want to make it right." He said the word director before I said it. He said it the way you say a word when you're acknowledging a debt rather than announcing a decision. He asked Raymond to schedule a follow-up meeting for the following morning, just the three of us, to discuss the specifics of title, compensation, and structure. I thanked him. I stood up. I shook his hand. Then I looked at Bryce, who had raised his eyes from the table and was watching me with an expression I can only describe as the beginning of something. Not shame exactly, and not quite understanding, but the precursor to both. And I said to him, because I meant it and because I think it was the right thing to say, "You're good in a room, Bryce. That's a real skill. I think you'll do well when you're in the right room." He didn't answer, but something in his face shifted. I left. The meeting the next morning was just Glenn, Raymond, and me. Glenn came in without his usual executive energy, quieter, more considered. He talked briefly about his father, about what the company was supposed to represent, about the specific mistake of letting personal loyalty substitute for professional rigor. He wasn't performing accountability. He was practicing it, which is harder and more valuable. Then he made the offer. Director of Brand Strategy. The title, official, retroactive in spirit if not in date. A salary correction that closed the full gap with Bryce's compensation and added a merit adjustment on top for 4 years of contributions that had been, in his words, the operational backbone of our best work. A formal restructuring of the brand team that would make my actual role visible and official in the organizational structure. And a direct reporting line to Glenn on all anchor client work going forward. I asked for 24 hours to review the written offer. He said, "Of course." I went back to my desk. Same chair I'd been sitting in for 4 years. Same view of the parking garage. Same hum of the open floor, keyboards and low conversations and the particular ambient sound of people doing their work. I sat for a moment and didn't do anything. Didn't open my laptop, didn't check my phone, just sat. For years. 4 years of being the unofficial version of the thing I had just been offered officially. 4 years of Sunday nights building frameworks that appeared in Monday morning presentations. 4 years of being considered, and we're still on track in the grinding, patient work of believing that the quality of the work would eventually be the argument that won. It had won. Not as quickly as it should have, and not without me deciding to stop waiting and start acting. But it had won. I accepted the offer the next morning, 7 minutes after the written version arrived in my inbox. I know you want to know what happened to Bryce. He was not fired. I'm going to tell you that directly because I think honest endings matter more than satisfying ones, and I also think this outcome is actually more interesting than a firing would have been. He was moved into a senior account management role, client-facing, relationship-driven, built around the things he was genuinely good at. The social fluency, the presentation skills, the ability to walk into a room and make people feel like they were in good hands. Those were real. They were always real. They just weren't strategy, and the role he'd been placed in required strategy, and the gap between what was real and what was required had been papered over with my work for 14 months. In the right role, I believe he was probably excellent. About 2 months after the restructuring, he found me in the kitchen one afternoon, the small one near the conference rooms, the quiet one that nobody used at that hour. He poured coffee and stood there for a moment, and then he said, "I've been thinking about what happened. I don't think I understood, I genuinely didn't understand, how much of what I was presenting wasn't mine. I thought we were collaborating. I think I was wrong about what that word meant. It was not a polished apology. It was a real one. I said, I know. I think you probably were collaborating from where you were standing. The problem was where we were each standing. He nodded. He poured his coffee. He left. I stood there for a minute afterward, and I thought about the specific category of people who cause harm not from malice but from never having been made to look carefully at the distance between their self-perception and their actual contribution. It is a larger category than we'd like to admit. And the solution, the only real solution, is not punishment. It is an accurate mirror, held up clearly at the right moment, by someone who did the work to make it undeniable. I had held up the mirror. The rest was his to do with. I want to leave you with 3 things. You know by now that 3 is the number I trust. The first, documentation is not paranoia. It is professionalism. Every piece of work I produced in those 14 months went through company email, and I had it all. Not because I was waiting to use it as a weapon. I wasn't planning any of this when I sent those emails. I kept records because I am someone who keeps records, who dates drafts, who maintains a clear history of what was built and when. That habit, unglamorous, unremarkable, the kind of thing nobody notices until it matters, was the single most decisive factor in how this story ended. Your sent folder is a ledger. Keep it current. The second, the truth doesn't need embellishment. It needs organization. I did not need to exaggerate anything in those 41 pages. I didn't need to characterize Bryce as a villain or frame Glenn as malicious or use language that could be read as grievance. The facts, laid out clearly and chronologically, told the story entirely on their own. That is almost always the case. When you are in the right, when the gap between what you've contributed and what you've been credited for is real and documented, the facts are sufficient. Organize them. Present them professionally. Let them land. The third, and this one I want you to sit with, the third is about what it means to wait. I waited 4 years. I told myself, for most of those 4 years, that patience was wisdom. And sometimes it was. But I think I also used patience as cover for avoiding the discomfort of confrontation. I told myself I was playing the long game when sometimes I was just delaying the moment I'd have to stand up and say, this is what I've done, this is what it's worth, and I am done waiting for someone else to name it first. The long game is real. Timing matters. You don't blow up your career to win a battle. But there is a difference between strategic patience and habitual avoidance, and the line between them is worth examining regularly. When the documentation is solid and the case is airtight and you've done the work to present it professionally, the right time to move is sooner than you think. You are not asking for a favor when you present accurate evidence of your own contributions. You are not being difficult or demanding or making it personal. You are presenting an invoice for services rendered. And you are entitled, professionally, legally, morally, to have that invoice taken seriously. So find what's in your sent folder. Organize it. Frame it correctly. Then send the email. If this story hit home, if you've got a Bryce in your building, if you're 4 years into doing director-level work under a senior title and you've been told one too many times that your promotion is being considered, drop it in the comments. Tell me where you are. This channel exists because people like you have stories worth telling, and the community down there is full of people who have been exactly where you are and got out the other side. Subscribe if you haven't. I put out a new story every week. Some of them are mine. Some of them are yours, because you've been sending them to me, and they are extraordinary, and I read every single one.